Right. And that makes sense. It makes sense that job creation would be the thing that actually sustains the economy, doesn't cause
Exactly.
inflation. It's a much healthier society for sure. But so question about that, because during 2020, they not only did they give people money, right? They gave everybody a bit of money to try to supposedly sustain themselves or whatever, but they did create those PPP loans, right? And they gave those to businesses in order to maintain jobs. Now that sounds a bit different than what you're talking about, because you're talking about growth, loans for growth. Is it the same concept if you give loans for just stick around, don't don't kill jobs, don't go anywhere?
Yes, exactly. That's not very productive. I mean, most people realize that what happened in 2020 was not very productive when these loans were given to companies. But actually, that's still a drop in the ocean. There was a much bigger problem, and that was really what created this inflation. Namely, um, the central banks adopted the type of QE I was recommending for Japan for a deflationary situation with a bust banking system and money supply contracting. My recommendation was central banks should purchase the non-performing assets from banks and the performing assets from non-banks. That way you get the bank balance sheets cleaned up, and by purchasing assets, central bank purchase of assets from non-banks, you're pushing money straight into the economy. That's what they did in March 2020. But the problem was that bank credit was already growing at 5, 6%. And in most countries, banks were doing fine. Bank credit was expanding. There was no deflation. But they were using a tool designed for a deflationary, contractionary situation. And they expanded money supply even more. So we had record, post-war record money supply expansion. And this was done by the central banks purchasing these assets. They hired the likes of BlackRock to um, to do this for them and just go out and purchase assets. And they used central bank money to fund this. Now that is direct money injection into the economy, and it was given to essentially asset owners and a whole lot of rich people, owners of some big businesses and financial players, made a fortune by this trillions of money being pumped into the economy directly from the central bank through this process of purchasing assets from non-banks. Now, they did this globally, and by the fact that it was so coordinated, it's a very specific policy, that is very rarely taken. I recommended it for Japan in 1994, 1995. For 20 years, the Bank of Japan has said, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. This is not possible. We can't do this. March 2020, come March 2020, the Bank of Japan knew exactly how to do it. And every other central bank, a major central bank, did it at the same time. And of course, that proves that it's not a coincidence. It's not a policy mistake, because it's a very, very specific policy. And by coincidence, they all took it in March 2020. So clearly, they knew exactly what they were doing, but that was the policy to create inflation. If you do this, you know for sure you're going to get inflation. That's why I warned from May 2020 onwards, when I had the data, they are creating significant inflation that's going to happen 18 months later. And that's exactly what happened. So it was a central bank policy choice, like, by the way, already in the 1970s, when most people think, oh, the 70s, that was the inflationary decade. That was due to OPEC and the oil embargo and all that oil stuff and the war in the Middle East. That's
Sounds
the
really
same story they're
similar.
trying to sell us,
Right? Yeah. Sounds
now.
exactly the
But
same.
really, it's not true. Already then, it was also the central banks doing this, if you look at the data.
Why would they do this? What's the point? I mean, I hear you. You're saying they're trying to create a crisis, because when you create a crisis, then you can affect change. What is the change you think they're trying to do right now to us?
Yes, well, actually, we have to look at the picture, the big picture of what has happened since 2020. And on the one hand, the central bankers have come out since 2020 very quickly, already in March 2020, with some public statements about what they want to do. And surprise, surprise, they want to introduce CBDCs. So that is clearly one goal. Now, in order to introduce central bank digital currencies, What they need is digital IDs. And clearly they've been working backwards from their goal. How can we introduce CBDCs? We need an excuse. And then work backwards. What do we need for that? We need digital IDs. Well, again, how do we introduce digital IDs? We need another excuse to do that. Well, the so-called pandemic delivered a great excuse. Well, at least they thought. I mean, it wasn't really very convincing, but somehow they argued that you needed to be injected with this experimental substance, and then somehow you need it in order to enter any restaurant or shop. You needed digital ID confirming that you'd been injected, when of course it was very quickly clear that this injection was not actually slowing transmission or preventing illness, and had a lot of risks attached to them. So the justification wasn't very strong, but they definitely pushed these digital IDs, the so-called vaccine passports, very hard, and again in a coordinated fashion. So you see where this is going. And the goal is actually on the monetary side. That is the prize they're aiming for. They're aiming for CBDCs connected to digital IDs. And that means we're talking about the most totalitarian control system in human history. Because this is a control tool that not only gives you, as a controller, complete visibility of what everyone is doing, every transaction. The money's moving from where to where, you know everything. But the monitoring is only one aspect. And of course, you can use that information for your purposes if you're the controller, the central planner. But actually, these CBDCs are programmable. And you can use tools, algorithms, big data algorithms, which they sell as artificial intelligence, in order to have rules about who can buy what for what purpose, at what time, and at what place, where, and therefore control your movement, control all your activities. And oh, Kim, you were critical of central banks recently. Oh, your CBDC is not working today, is it? Or you're trying to buy this book. Oh, you can buy another book, but not that one. That's a bit too critical of central banks. So you can see this. I mean, this in history, and also the human history of dictatorships, there's never been such a powerful control tool as they're about to introduce. And that is the big prize they're aiming for, I think.
That is really scary. What can we do you think, to prevent this from happening? I mean, are you a proponent of going back to the gold standard, or I mean, what should we be doing to prevent this? Because this is very frightening. And you're right, it's a total, complete way to control people. They can shut down your bank accounts at any time. We saw them do that with the trucker convoy in Canada, and we saw them
precisely,
go after them.
precisely.
Yeah. So they can do this,
and that was even before
everything.
CBDCs. Right. So exactly. So we'll definitely use CBDCs to shut down opposition. People want to demonstrate. Well, we're suddenly they can't buy food. So what can we do? Well, you mentioned gold. I like gold. Going back to basics is always good. Actually, when you go into the monetary history, the ancient monetary systems were not even based on gold and silver. That came later. The oldest are simply credit systems of mutual records of credit. And you can see this easily being recreated in any small village. You go to this village pub, and you don't have cash with you, and they know you. Okay, we'll write it down. That's how it starts. People trade with each other and they just write it down. Well, you just need something more visible than that. There was a very elaborate system in England for hundreds of years based on tally sticks, where you make notches, and they could be split in the middle. They're wooden sticks, and one was kept at the central place. The foil and the stock would circulate because it was a stick comes from the German word for stick, stock. That's where stocks and shares comes from. And then if you have doubts, you can always check whether the two parts of the tally, the split tally, match. If they match, they tally, it tallies. And if they don't, you were foiled because the foil didn't match the stock. And they had a big procedure for basing their whole accounting on this, where a lot of the financial expressions actually come from this system at the Exchequer in England. There was a big chessboard to do the calculations. That's where the word exchequer comes from. And also checks when you pay with a check. There was a roll, which was actually from vellum, which is like cow skin, where they took the notes. It was the counter roll, contre roll in French. The Normans spoke French when they introduced this. That's where the word control comes from. The audit system comes from. So we could have basically, somebody in every village could have a record of key transactions, and you could have a credit-based system from scratch, very, very simply. It could also be run on an Excel spreadsheet if you have electricity, but it's probably good to have it on paper if electricity gets shut off or there's a power cut. And of course, you can use gold or silver as the measures of the units of account if you want, grams of gold and silver. And so basically you could go back to a system that's anchored to gold and silver, and then you can have credit on top of that, which is just a local record of who owes what. And there's your monetary system. Now, of course, that is in effect in place when you have a community bank, or you have several small local community banks that only engage or mainly engage with the local community, which is really my recommendation for the interim. We still have a bit of time because the central planners have realized they can't force the CBDCs on us just yet. And they've also, it looks like last year, they've decided to take the slow road to CBDCs, which is the so-called wholesale CBDC. That's the Chinese version of CBDCs, whereby the banks are not yet driven out of business. Retail CBDCs, as you mentioned, that's ultimately the central bank competing against the banks. It means the central bank will offer an account at the central bank for everyone. And when they do that, then of course, as soon as you have a crisis, everyone will shift their money from the banks to the central bank, and then the banking system is finished. That's ultimately what they want. Because, what do the central planners want? Well, they want centralization of that power. But at the moment, the banks create money. They create most of the money. So ultimately, it looks like they want to compete against the banks. That's what they're saying when they talk about CBDCs. And they will, they have the power to drive the banks out of business if they introduce these retail CBDCs. But in China, where they had a Soviet-style system with one central bank and no banks, and that seems to be what the central planners want to reintroduce. But in China, they created thousands of banks only 40 years ago. In the last 40 years, thousands of banks were created, and that's how China was so successful, because a decentralized system with many banks creating money and small banks lending to small firms, because big banks don't lend to small firms. That's how you get economic growth. That's how you make sure small firms and small mom and pop shops are doing well. If you've got small local banks, that's how China is successful. So China refused to introduce the retail CBDCs because that kills the banks. They introduced what is called wholesale CBDCs, where the central bank digital currency can only be obtained through a bank, and therefore the banks are safe. It looks like they've conceded that, and in Europe and America, when they introduce CBDCs, will also be the wholesale CBDCs, which is good news. That means we have a bit of time to establish more community banks and anchor them in the local community. And then we can also prepare, basically put in place systems for when they want to shut down the community banks and have central, retail CBDCs. Then we can switch to a local system that is using the local bank, but is linked to gold and silver as a numeraire, and that can work very effectively.
Yeah, and it seems like the pandemic might have shown them that we're not quite that easy to control. There's still a substantial number of us that are
Yes,
like,
there is
no,
hope.
not
There is
doing
hope.
that. Yeah. Yeah, so that is, I think, the hope there is that we can push back on this, and especially awareness. I think the awareness of the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, what central banks are doing, really just kind of saying, we're on to you, right? We're on to what you're trying to do to us, that you're trying to consolidate power, control us through digital IDs, control us through digital money, get us to the point where, yes, everything is, that's why they're saying you will own nothing and you will be happy because all of that would be centralized. Somebody else would own it. We wouldn't. Same thing with the banks, no community banks, suck them up because it's all centralized. You don't, none of that is for the little guy. It's all for the big players. And then they control all of the rest of us like puppets. It's really, it's great that we are becoming more aware, that we're talking more about this. And then hopefully by doing that, we will have some rogue political leaders who will say, we're not falling for it, and we're going to set up some systems to protect ourselves, to isolate our states or our communities in some way. That seems to be the hope moving forward. And as you mentioned, advocating for small community banks. And now I'm thinking, I got to go get a small community bank. I got to go start banking at a credit union or something.
Yes, you should. Yes. And I'm also working to set up new community banks. So if any of your viewers wants to join, get in touch with me. ProfessorWerner.org is a website where I've got also my work and my scientific articles there. There's also an email to get in touch, or follow me on Twitter, Scientific Econ, or Professor Werner.
Well, if that conversation didn't convince you to start looking into investing in gold, I don't know what will. There you have it. I mean, look, as they're moving us towards a digital currency in an attempt to control us, it is more and more increasingly important that we figure out a way to, just get around them and continue to remain autonomous in some way. And gold, investing in gold, having either physical gold or having an IRA in precious metals, which is where your gold is safely stored and it's an IRA or a 401k that they can be converted over to that IRA in precious metals. It's like, I think this really showcases why that is so important. Birch Gold will help you get started on this process. You can go to birchgold.com/Kim. You'll get a free info kit. They will walk you through the process of whether or not you want to purchase gold that you're going to store yourself, or you want them to store it. There's a safe, secure places where they store it for you so that you don't have it, in your closet somewhere or something. And they will walk you through the process of how to get yourself into the world of precious metals, how you could convert your current 401k, your current IRA into an IRA in precious metals. They will walk you through that entire process. So birchgold.com/Kim, get your free info kit. And you heard it, they're trying to move us to a currency where they can control us. So it's best to take matters into our own hands and secure our own futures so that we're not being controlled by the powers that be. So birchgold.com/Kim and get your free info kit.